It was supposed to be a simple project, a return to my roots, to the place where my family had spent every summer since the 60s. The cabin wasn't much, small, weathered, but full of memories. My dad had built it with his own hands, and I'd promised him I'd restore it. I'd spent years working in the city, chasing a career, trying to make ends meet. But the moment I inherited the land from my uncle, I knew it was time to reconnect. I could already picture the place, clearing out the overgrown brush, fixing up the old wood stove, replacing the leaky roof. The perfect escape from the noise and stress of city life. I was ready, my bags were packed, the truck loaded with tools, and I had a map of the property that I'd pored over for weeks. The cabin was tucked away in the woods, about an hour outside town. Peaceful, isolated, a perfect spot to rebuild, both the cabin and my own life. I hadn't been up there in a while, but the land was always in the family. I didn't expect anything to have changed, but when I turned the last corner and saw the open space where my cabin used to sit, I slammed on the brakes. The spot where the cabin stood? Gone. There wasn't even a trace of it left. In its place was a shiny new house, 2 stories, with large windows and a sleek, modern design that stuck out like a sore thumb against the natural landscape. I sat there for a few moments, staring at it, trying to process what I was seeing. My hands gripped the steering wheel, and my mind raced. I couldn't have missed it. My cabin was supposed to be right here. This new house wasn't just on the property. It was sitting exactly where my cabin had stood. I pulled up slowly, not sure what I'd find. A tall, well-dressed woman stepped out onto the porch. She didn't look like she belonged here. Too polished, too perfect for the rugged land we'd grown up on. She gave me a smile, but it wasn't the friendly, welcoming kind. It was that smile people get when they know they've already won, even before the fight starts. "Can I help you?" she called, stepping toward my truck. I hesitated for a second. "What's going on here?" I finally asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "This is my family's land. Where's the cabin?" She smiled again, like she was doing me a favor. "Oh, I'm sorry, you must be mistaken. This is now my property. I've had the rights for over a year now. I'm Trish, by the way. I built this house." My stomach dropped. I took a deep breath. "No, this property's been in my family for decades. I have the deed right here," I said, pulling it from the glove compartment. She barely glanced at it. "Well, that's all fine and dandy, but you must not be aware of the rules. This land's been annexed by the Willow Creek HOA. I was able to get approval to build here." I was starting to lose my patience. "Annexed? This is family property. What are you talking about?" She shrugged almost dismissively. "You're probably unfamiliar with the process, but the HOA controls all these lands now. I've followed the rules, got all the permits, and now I'm the proud owner of this plot. Your cabin was in disrepair and wasn't officially registered anymore, so it was legally abandoned." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Abandoned. The cabin wasn't just a place on a map. It was part of our history. My dad had made sure it was well cared for. It wasn't falling apart. It wasn't abandoned. I opened my mouth to argue, but she cut me off, clearly getting tired of this conversation. "I'm sorry for the misunderstanding, but there's nothing I can do about it. I've paid for this land, I've followed the rules, and this is my home now." I looked around, feeling a mix of anger and disbelief. The HOA? How could this have happened without me knowing? How could they take the land away from my family like this? Trish smiled again, more condescending this time. "You should talk to the HOA if you want more details. But if you're planning to rebuild, well, you'll have to work something out with them. They're pretty strict about development in this area." I stood there staring at her for a moment, trying to hold it together. My dad's cabin, the place where I had spent every summer growing up, was gone. And this woman, this stranger, was acting like she'd just purchased a piece of land at a bargain sale. "Don't worry, I'm sure they'll be happy to talk with you," she added, turning and walking back into the house. I stood there rooted to the spot, looking at the house where my cabin had stood. I could feel the weight of it all, the loss, the betrayal. But one thing was clear. I wasn't about to let her, or the HOA, get away with this. I'd take it all back. In court if I had to. They had no idea who they were messing with. The drive back to town was a blur of frustration and disbelief. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles were white. My mind kept racing. How had this happened? How could Trish just waltz in and claim the land? And why hadn't I been notified about this annexation by the HOA? I knew I had to act fast. I wasn't about to let this go without a fight. But first, I needed to figure out exactly what had happened. I stopped by the local records office the next morning. The county clerk's office was a small, quiet building in the center of town, tucked between an old diner and a hardware store. I walked in, greeted the clerk behind the desk, and explained my situation. She listened carefully, then pulled up the property records. Her face was unreadable as she typed into the system, clicking away at the keyboard. "Here we go," she said after a moment. "It looks like there was a transfer of the property rights last year, but—" I felt my heart drop. "There's a catch," she continued, her tone a little more cautious now. "It wasn't an outright sale. The land was essentially annexed by the Willow Creek HOA. They reclassified it as abandoned due to the cabin's condition, and from there, it was turned over to whoever was willing to build on it." "What do you mean, whoever was willing to build on it?" I asked, my voice rising. "This land has been in my family for generations. I'm not sure how they got away with it," the clerk said, looking uncomfortable. "But according to this, everything was signed off by the HOA president, Trish Harper." My blood ran cold. Of course it was her. I hadn't even realized who she was when we first met. But now it made perfect sense. She had everything to gain from getting her hands on prime real estate, especially if she was working behind the scenes with the HOA to push things through. The thought of her knowing this whole time and then pretending to be so smug about it, it made my stomach churn. I gathered the paperwork, thanked the clerk, and left. My mind was already turning, coming up with a plan. I needed to get the deed back. I needed to prove that the transfer was illegal, and I needed the support of the community. That afternoon, I made calls. I contacted a lawyer named Mark Collins, who came highly recommended for property disputes. Mark had handled cases like mine before, where shady deals were struck behind closed doors and land was taken under false pretenses. I was hoping he'd take me seriously, even if the fight felt like David versus Goliath. When we met, I told him everything. How my cabin had been on the land for decades, how it had been in the family since my grandfather built it in the 1940s. He listened quietly, taking notes, his eyes narrowing in thought as I spoke. "You've got a case," he said after a moment. "It looks like the HOA violated its own rules, and this could be an issue of false transfer. We'll need to dig into the documents, figure out who signed what and when, and then we can challenge the whole thing." I felt a flicker of hope. What about Trish and the house she built? "We'll figure that out," Mark said. "But if we can prove the land was illegally taken from you, the house may need to be removed, or at least you'll be entitled to compensation." I spent the next few weeks gathering everything I could. I got in touch with old neighbors who remembered the cabin, even found a few photos of it. The more I dug, the clearer it became. Trish had used her position with the HOA to manipulate the system, hiding behind paperwork and false claims to take what wasn't hers. The breakthrough came when I found out that Trish had arranged a series of meetings, allegedly to survey the land, under the pretext of a community initiative. No one had been notified, and no one was given a chance to contest anything. The HOA had claimed the cabin was uninhabitable, but the cabin was fully intact when I had left it. Mark confirmed it. She was building her case the entire time. She knew what she was doing, and that was when it hit me. This wasn't just about my cabin. It was about the entire neighborhood. People had been afraid to speak out, afraid of what the HOA could do. The more I talked to neighbors, the more I learned that many of them had dealt with similar tactics from the HOA, fines for trivial things, rules enforced with no warning. Anyone who stepped out of line got penalized. This wasn't just a fight for my cabin anymore. This was about exposing the corrupt system Trish had been running and taking back what was rightfully ours. The next step was to confront the HOA. I knew it was going to be a fight, maybe even an ugly one, but with Mark's help, we were ready. It was time to take it all back. The first step was simple: gathering evidence. I wasn't just going to march into the HOA offices and demand my property back. No, I needed everything. The records, the contracts, the emails, anything that could expose how Trish had manipulated the entire system. Mark and I spent the next few days combing through every piece of paperwork I could get my hands on. We even went back to the county office to request more documentation. I knew that Trish had a hand in the illegal transfer, but I had to prove it beyond a shadow of a doubt. Every time I felt like we were getting close, something new would pop up that pushed me even further into the rabbit hole. The more I uncovered, the more I realized how deep this went. Trish had been running a quiet operation for years, taking advantage of homeowners who weren't paying attention, exploiting vague laws, and using her position to get ahead. What struck me the most, though, was the sheer audacity of it. The cabin wasn't just a random piece of land. It was part of a larger trend where Trish and the HOA had slowly and methodically seized control over properties with little to no legal standing. It was clear this had been happening for some time. One night, as I was sitting at my kitchen table, looking over a map of the land, Mark called. "Tom, I've got something." He sounded different, urgent. "What did you find?" I asked, leaning forward. "The HOA meetings. We've got a set of minutes from the past 3 years. There's one in particular I want you to look at. It's from a closed-door meeting, highly irregular. But what's inside?" He paused. "It's about your land, and it has Trish's signature on it." I felt a rush of adrenaline. I flipped open my laptop, pulling up the document Mark had sent me. As I skimmed through it, I saw it. Trish had filed a motion in one of the closed meetings to reclassify the land where my cabin stood. The motion, signed off by her, was intended to transfer ownership from private land to HOA-controlled property. There were also references to legalizing any potential construction on the land by removing the cabin and building a new structure for community use. It hit me like a freight train. Trish had not only taken my cabin, but she had intended to turn the entire property into something the HOA could use for its own benefit. A community event space, a property she could sell or rent out. This was no simple land grab. This was about control. This was about power. I called Mark immediately. "This is it. This is what we need," I said, almost in disbelief. "She never thought this would see the light of day, did she?" Mark laughed, though there was no humor in it. "Not a chance. This is exactly what we've been looking for." The next day, we filed for a formal injunction, requesting the court to freeze any further action on the property until the case could be fully reviewed. We also demanded an immediate review of the HOA's actions, particularly the illegal annexation of private properties under false pretenses. The ball was rolling, and I could feel the momentum shifting in our favor. But Trish wasn't going down without a fight. That afternoon, I received a letter from her lawyer. It was a standard cease and desist, accusing me of slander and threatening legal action if I didn't withdraw my claims. The letter was full of legal jargon, but the message was clear. I was to stop pursuing this case or face a countersuit for defamation. I grinned when I read it. It was exactly what I expected from someone like Trish, trying to intimidate me with legal threats. But it wasn't going to work. Not this time. I called Mark and forwarded him the letter. "They're rattling the cage," I said, "but it's not going to scare me off." He agreed. "It's desperation. They've got nothing left but threats. We're exposing them for what they are." That evening, I drove back to the land, standing on the old foundation where my cabin had once stood. I could almost hear my dad's voice in my head, telling me to never back down, to fight for what was rightfully mine. And that's exactly what I was going to do. The next court date was set for the following month. As we prepared for the battle, I knew one thing. I wasn't just fighting for my family's cabin. I was fighting for every homeowner who had been bullied by Trish in the HOA. This was bigger than just me. I was going to take everything back, in court and in front of the community. And when this was all over, no one would ever have to live in fear of Trish Harper and her HOA again. The weeks leading up to the court date were a blur of preparation. Mark and I were working tirelessly to build our case. We spent hours going through old property records, tracking down anyone who could be a witness, and gathering every shred of evidence that could prove the HOA's actions were not just illegal, but downright fraudulent. I wasn't alone in this fight. The more I spoke to neighbors, the more I realized how many people had suffered under Trish's leadership. She had threatened, fined, and manipulated homeowners for years, and now they were finally ready to speak out. It wasn't just my cabin at stake. It was their homes, their livelihoods, and the future of the community. I called several neighbors, including Carl, who had lived here longer than anyone else. He'd known my family, and he had seen the slow but steady way Trish had been dismantling the integrity of the HOA. "Trish is bad news, Tom," Carl said when I asked him about his dealings with her. "I've been paying fines for the past 5 years for having my fence too tall, but I know for a fact there are people here who've done worse and never got a fine." "Did you ever challenge her?" I asked. He chuckled bitterly. "I tried once. They told me to pay up or donate to a community improvement fund. That's when I knew I had no chance. But hearing about your case, it's giving me hope. Maybe we can finally put a stop to it." Carl wasn't the only one. More and more people came forward with their stories, ready to back me up in court. Each witness added weight to the case, and with every conversation, I began to feel the true scope of Trish's abuse of power. The day of the court hearing finally arrived. My stomach was tight, but there was a feeling of resolve in the air. Mark had spent the morning going over our strategy, making sure everything was in place. We had the evidence, we had the witnesses, and most importantly, we had the truth. The courtroom was packed. The community members who had rallied behind me were there, and I could see the determination in their eyes. They were done being intimidated. They wanted justice. When Trish walked in, she had that same smug smile on her face. She was dressed in a tailored suit, looking every bit the part of the confident HOA president, though I could tell she was feeling the pressure. She wasn't as sure of herself as she used to be. Her lawyer, a sharp-dressed man who seemed more interested in arguing than listening, stood next to her. He flashed us a cold look as he took his seat. Mark stood up first. "Your Honor, we are here today to address the illegal actions of the Willow Creek HOA, specifically its president, Ms. Trish Harper. We intend to prove that the transfer of property to Ms. Harper's possession was both unlawful and manipulative, and that the land in question was fraudulently annexed from the Callahan family without consent." The judge nodded. "Proceed." I could feel the weight of the room on me as I took the stand. It was a strange feeling, like all eyes were on me. But it wasn't fear, it was power. I had the truth on my side. Mark began by asking me about the history of my family's cabin and the land we owned. I told the story of my father, of the summers spent there, and how my uncle had passed it on to me after his death. I explained how the land had always been in our family and how it had been taken without my knowledge or consent. Then came the hard part. Mark introduced the documents, the transfer of property signed by Trish. He pointed out how the dates didn't line up, how signatures appeared forged, and how the records showed no legal procedure for the annexation. Trish's lawyer tried to argue that it was a simple clerical error, but it was too late. The evidence spoke for itself. Next, we brought in the witnesses. Carl was the first to testify. His voice shook slightly, but he spoke with conviction, detailing how he had been fined repeatedly for arbitrary reasons, including the supposed height of his fence. He described the pressure Trish had put on him and others in the neighborhood, and how she used her position to collect fines that didn't make sense. One by one, other neighbors took the stand, recounting their experiences with Trish. Some had been fined for things as simple as having an unapproved mailbox or planting flowers that didn't fit the HOA's aesthetic standards. All of them had been afraid to speak up, until now. Trish's lawyer tried to discredit the witnesses, but it was clear the tide was turning. The judge listened intently, and I could see the skepticism on his face grow as each piece of evidence came in. Trish had no leg to stand on. Then came the final blow. Mark introduced a set of emails Trish had sent to various board members, asking them to approve the annexation of the land under the pretense of community improvement. But the emails revealed something even worse. Trish had been offering financial incentives to board members in exchange for their support in the land deal. The room went dead silent. Trish's face turned white as the judge leaned forward, his gaze fixed on her. Her lawyer stammered, trying to mount a defense, but it was too late. The judge spoke. "Ms. Harper, Your actions have violated the trust of the community. Your illegal manipulation of the property transfer, combined with the fraud and coercion, is unacceptable. This court finds in favor of the Callahan family, and the land in question will be returned to them immediately. Additionally, we will be launching a full investigation into the Willow Creek HOA's activities, including the financial dealings you've conducted. A wave of relief washed over me. I couldn't believe it. I had won. The judge banged his gavel, signaling the end of the case. Trish didn't speak. She just stood there staring at the judge, her face pale and defeated. But the victory wasn't just mine. It was the community's. The people who had been oppressed for so long had finally taken back their land, their voices, and their dignity. As I walked out of the courtroom, my heart swelling with pride, I knew that this was only the beginning. The community was finally free, and I had taken everything back. The days after the court ruling felt surreal. The weight that had been hanging over me for so long had finally lifted. But it wasn't just about winning in court. It was about what had come with that victory. The next morning, I drove back to the property. I had been away for weeks during the legal battle, and I wanted to see it for myself. Standing at the edge of what used to be my cabin's foundation, I felt a strange mixture of loss and hope. The house Trish had built was still there, but it no longer held any claim over me. I had my land back, and the community had its freedom. Neighbors came by to congratulate me, to thank me for fighting, for standing up when so many were too afraid to. It wasn't just a legal win. It was the end of years of fear and intimidation. It was about reclaiming what had always belonged to us. A few days later, I met with Mark at his office to finalize the paperwork. The land was officially mine again. We also discussed the next steps, how the HOA, now under new leadership, would be restructured. I was asked to be part of the community council, a role I never expected to have, but one that felt right. After everything that had happened, it seemed like the right time to get involved, to help guide the neighborhood into a more peaceful future. But there was one thing I had to do first. I drove up to the house Trish had built. I had a few final words for her, even though I knew she'd be avoiding me for a while. As I walked up the driveway, I saw her through the window, standing in the kitchen, her back turned. I knocked on the door, and when she opened it, there was no smile, no smugness in her eyes, just exhaustion. "I just wanted to say one thing, Trish," I said, my voice steady but firm. "You may have thought you could control everything here, but this land, this neighborhood, these people don't belong to you." She didn't answer. She just stood there, her eyes blank. For a moment, I thought she might cry, but she didn't. "You won," she finally said, almost in a whisper. "I didn't win alone," I replied. "The whole neighborhood stood with me. You can't bully people into silence forever." She didn't say anything else, just stepped back and closed the door softly. I stood there for a moment longer, letting the weight of it sink in. I walked back to my truck, the silence between us lingering. The next few weeks were a blur of changes. The HOA was completely overhauled. Trish's actions were fully investigated, and she was removed from any future involvement with the organization. The neighbors who had lived in fear for so long began to speak up, share their concerns, and take part in the decisions that affected their homes. The land where my cabin used to be, I wasn't sure what I'd do with it yet. The new house that Trish had built would likely stay, but I wasn't focused on that anymore. What mattered was that I had my rightful place in this community, and that was something no one could take away. One evening, I stood on the property, looking out over the land that had been in my family for generations. The trees whispered in the wind, the same way they had when my father and grandfather had stood there. It was more than just a piece of land. It was history. It was home.